Good evening, everyone. As they mentioned, my name is Sandra Esparza, and I'm part of St. Joseph Church. So tonight we are going to do our research during this past year. So it's kind of we're gonna give you overall where we're working so far those last past years. We're gonna give you introduction. We're gonna describe our situation, our problem right now, and at the end we're gonna give you some solutions. During this past year, we were working so hard with the whole entire community. We just meet with every single council member of a city of Mountain View, one-to-one. We're just working with different community organizations, like a PACT, like Cafecito, and also we are being part of two churches, which is San Athanasius Church and St. Joseph Church. Also, we meet with so many attorneys, housing attorneys, and a lot of administration people. One is our supervisor, Jose Median, and so on. But the most important in our research, it is about what we focus on. Where we meet is with Royal Viking 2005. This is the most important because we work with them one-to-one. We just really feel what their struggle right now. We just feel their situation while we're working so hard for them. So this is a real example why we're here tonight. So we're reviewing everything, me and Daniel, tonight. As you know, we have people of many races and ethnicities in our community. In 2030, the city of Mountain View embraces sustainable living and provides for the needs of all residents. It is a place that values its diversity, balances preservation with innovation, and provides quality education. So this is our truly value as a city. It is really important to keep a strength in this value. So important to keep staying and keep our diversity together.
Thank you, Sandra. So as we just saw, Mountain View as a city recognizes the importance of diversity. And because of that value, that core value in the city, it calls us to pay special attention to the displacement crisis that still, in some ways, exists here. And so part of why we're called to pay special attention to that is that evictions and displacement have a disproportionate impact, specifically on people of color. And as you can see from some of the research up here, even a more disproportionate impact on women of color. And so if we're going to be a city that truly values our diversity and wants to keep people from a whole range of backgrounds, et cetera, here, we need to make sure that we are addressing head-on the challenge to that value presented by the displacement crisis.
So Daniel, so we really need to keep this in mind, right? So we need to keep preserve our diversity. That's what our value it is, right? We need to work so through for this value. Thank you, Daniel.
Yep. Yeah, and so here in Mountain View, on this point of trying to maintain our diversity, Mountain View is building a lot more housing than many other cities around us in this particular region. But a critical question is housing for whom? And as you can see from some of the numbers that we've pulled here from the state agency that oversees new permits for new housing, the vast majority of housing that has been permitted in the city of Mountain View recently is specifically for high-end luxury developments. So yeah, sorry.
So what do you see in this slide? It is most of the housing, or our 245% is luxury. So I think we have to rethink as all the council members, because we have to have sort of balance. we need to have balance. It can be everything in one side, and it can be approving all the luxury apartments or housing or townhousing. It has to have some sort of balance. I think we have to rethink, not only think, it's rethinking one more time. Thank you. But guess what? Not everything is really bad in Mountain View, because we have a rent control. As you noticed that in our slideshow, the rent control protects approximately 30,000 residents, which is great because you guys, as a part of Mountain View, we made this path to vote, and that means we're showing that we can do that. So, yes, celebrate this, Daniel. Woo. Woo.
So that is a critical victory. The successive Measure V is one of the highlights, I think, of the housing justice movement over the last number of years, like 30 years, really. And we've made big strides forward, but we still have challenges as a city. And so some of these challenges actually predate Measure V. So one of the challenges that we have in this city is specifically the demolition of housing and the redevelopment of housing that is occupied by and affordable to people who are of lower income. And so this was happening before we ever got rent control. There were demolitions happening of apartment buildings. They were being sold to speculators and being knocked down. The difference now that we have rent control is how much more valuable that housing is. The rent-controlled housing stock now is a community asset that has been created by the voters of Mountain View, and losing that community asset has a community-wide impact. When we have demolitions that tear down housing, we not only lose the residents who actually live in them, but we lose a unit of rent-controlled housing that we're not going to get back. So being able to address this is critical, both to protect our residents and to protect this new community asset that we have fought so hard for here in Mountain View. So the situation that the residents in 2005 Rock Street are facing isn't unique. As we just saw, there's been over somewhere between 600, the Mountain View Voice is reporting 740 demolition-related evictions since 2015. We're still trying to pin down exactly what that number is, but we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of them. This here is a recent news article that came out in The Voice of another redevelopment project that's going to demolish 50+ units just down the street. It's another apartment complex on Rock Street at a different address in the same neighborhood facing the exact same problem. So we just want to highlight this, that this really is a community-wide problem. It's not just isolated to what we're facing here in Rock Street. So now I get to put my lawyer hat on and talk a little bit from a technical perspective about some of the policy approaches that we can take to address this problem. So tonight we're just going to very lightly touch 3 buckets or 3 categories of solutions. So here we have a summary of the 3 of them, and then we've got a slide on each to go into a little bit more detail. So the first one is a temporary moratorium on demolitions. The second would be to use the zoning ordinance to increase public oversight of demolitions so that there's more public participation and citizen kind of guidance over what happens in those situations. And then the third is kind of a bucket of potential other solutions. So there could be a 1-for-1 replacement requirement. There could be a policy saying, sure, building new ownership units in Mountain View is totally fine. There's no problem with that. Just don't knock down people's homes to do that. Focus that development somewhere else where you're not going to displace our existing residents, for example. So we'll get into the details of those. Oh, sorry, can we go back? I'll just do just a quick bit on each of these. So just for those who aren't familiar, a moratorium is essentially a temporary pause. The purpose of a moratorium is to give space for good policy making. So it's not permanent. It's saying no demolitions ever more in the city of Mountain View. What it says is in order to have a conversation about how to address this problem in a long-term way, we need a sense of calm in the city. to have rational, productive conversation. And we can't be in a rational, productive conversation from a place of calm when hundreds of people are being displaced at this very moment. We need to put a temporary halt on that so we can engage in good long-term policymaking. The second category approaches this from a zoning perspective. So I'm sure lots of people in here are familiar with zoning, but for those who are not, it's essentially the rules in the city that decide what gets built where. And there's all kinds of different mechanisms. One mechanism that has been used in other cities is one that increases public oversight and has more public accountability for demolitions. So this is the wonkiest I get, or at least I hope, in this presentation. But one technique to do this would be to require what's called a conditional use permit for the demolition of any multifamily housing. So what that means is there's a city process to essentially review this through public hearings where the decision makers have to make specific findings that are identified in the statute. And there's room for public debate about what should those findings be. Should we be considering the displacement of the residents in that building? If we're going to think about approving a demolition, for example, that could be mandated in the statute. Other cities have done this, particularly in places where they have also won critical protections for that key community asset, which is the rent-controlled housing stock. So in East Palo Alto, we've recently made this move. San Francisco has had a policy like this on the books for a long time. The idea is not to say never any demolitions. The idea is to say, if you're going to remove that really important community asset, we want there to be scrutiny over what you're doing. So then the third is kind of a bucket of various other options. I'll just to kind of put them on the table. The idea here is, like, you see some of this stuff is technical and there's a lot of options. This is why we think it's so important to have them pause a moratorium. We should allow space for public debate on some of these issues and really work through what's most appropriate for the city of Mountain View. So one, just to put a couple of examples on the table, one would be to say we want to channel new ownership. Nothing wrong necessarily with new ownership housing, but let's channel that development into areas where it doesn't cause direct displacement, for example. That could be a policy the city could consider. Another would be to say, okay, maybe sometimes redevelopment of older housing stock does make sense. We heard some of the residents say maybe there's instances where that's true. But we should require, or one option would be to require, one-for-one replacement of those units with the right of return for tenants. Perhaps you give more density in that situation to make that work out as a kind of deal. But that would be something you could consider to say, okay, sure, maybe redevelopment can happen, but we still value and we center the lives of our existing residents. And we make sure that they get to stay here in our community. So, just to overview again, because like I said, I know some of this can be a little bit technical. Here we've got 3 buckets of approaches. So a moratorium, a zoning code approach, and then several other policy approaches that the city council could pursue. And I'm sure that there are indeed others that if we have a robust public conversation, we could get into those details. So do you want to? So this is what's
before that we don't know that this day and the time is gonna change. Nazanet, can you give us an update, please, on this so I can inform to the whole city of Mountain View what's going on that day? Thank you, Nazanet.
You got it.
Hi, I'm Nazanin. I'm also a housing attorney with Community Legal Services. A few minutes before this meeting started, we received an email from the city planner who's responsible for this project, informing us that the hearing on the city council meeting on this project has been postponed to December 11th. So it's a huge win. Yeah. So what that means is that this date that you see up here when we were asking you to come out, change that, cross it out on whatever it is that you use, your Google Calendar, and just scoot it on over to December 11th and plan to be there anyway. So thank you all.
Thank you.